I'm going to cover a couple of projects in this first session. The first one is the review of fresh litter supply management and spent litter utilisation. It's a project that finished late in 2018, 2019. There's a report available for that. I've put the web address up there for people to get a hold of it, but you can basically just type in that title there and you'll get access to that 128-page report. So I'm just going to briefly cover off on it, and then I'll move on to the current project, which is looking at the risk assessment of alternative litters, which sort of come out of this review project. A bit of a background. So yeah, did a bit of stakeholder consultation, did a survey, basically to update what's happening with litter from the last one. I think Jeff Rung did back in 2007 with Ken Casey. Review potential new sources of litter, so what's out there, what people are using from that survey and what's in the literature. Review the management options that reduce the volume of litter, fresh litter required, and consider options for spent litter management associated with changing your litter type or changing your management, i.e. to reuse or something else. So just a bit of background, important functions of litter, obviously to absorb moisture, to dilute the excreta, certainly to provide, good thermal properties, so good insulation for the birds and for them to express their normal behaviour. So there's a whole bunch of desirable characteristics of litter there, which you're probably well aware of. So cost is obviously a big one. So how you acquire it, transport, storage, how available it is, ease of handling issues, the possibility of reuse you obviously have to think about as well. So does the litter material you're choosing, is it suitable for reuse? Water activity is obviously a very big one that Mark's done a fair bit of work on. So it's absorption capacity, and it's very importantly its drying capacity then. So how you get the moisture back out of it through ventilation. Minimal compaction caking, so low gas emissions, particularly we're talking about ammonia, but then environmental ones like odour as well, if the moisture content increases. So also low microbial development. With the environmental stuff, can it be reused or can it be utilised in land applications so it doesn't contain anything that would limit that in certain applications? And last but not least, the bird health as well. So yeah, probably not surprising. So these are the main litter materials found from that survey: wood shaving, sawdust, straw and rice hulls in that order. A bit of general information there from producers on how many birds they're stocking, how many batches a year, what the average litter depth is, and they come back and averages about 56 mils. And I think Linda found that about 90% of them comply or exceed the RSPCA litter standards. And probably up from the 2007 survey on the reuse of litter back in the sheds, there was about 19% of people doing that. Cost, obviously a big issue, that all survey participants identify that as a problem. It's increased not in any particular state, but all around the country. And in southern states, particularly the added cost of drying wet litter, which can be significant in wet winters when you've got to use heaters as well. Major supply problems when they did the survey in WA and South Australia, and certainly other states have also identified as potential problems in the future. Some of the other key issues, obviously wet litter, so management costs might come with extra tilling, drying time between batches if you're reusing. Bird health issues, so management costs with poor quality litter that must be managed more to reduce any bird health issues. So if you've got that poor quality litter, you're sort of behind the 8 ball there to start with. And then they also, survey participants identified RSPCA standards that are quite prescriptive, favours deep litter with questionable scientific basis, extra tilling is required, additional costs to growers, and can inhibit the adoption of alternative litter types that might necessarily mean things like a set depth to work effectively. Costs, so over 65% looking for alternatives due to the costs. So they were the costs back in the range of costs back in 2017 from $10 to $40. So we just put a bit of a graph on the side there showing the different costs of shaving, sawdust, rice hulls and straw. Rice hulls and straw are obviously affected by climate effects, and I'm quite sure this straw price and rice hull price during the height of drought in 2019 would have been way more than $40 and probably triple or quadruple that price. Transport is a significant component of litter costs, and supply can drive up that cost of it. So what do we mean with alternative litters? So obviously the common ones are the 4 that I mentioned that are most commonly used now, but also the project obviously looked at a whole range of alternatives, many dozens of them. So some of the ones here, for examples that have been used before in Australia or overseas. So peat, sand, recycled pallets, pelleted stuff that might be made from straw, nut hulls, different grasses, grape mark. So the issues with alternatives are that some of the risks from them are not really known because no one's used them a heck of a lot. So any of the problems mightn't have shown up. So that sort of led on to the next project. So alternative litters, some of the issues, obviously, you've got to be careful of the economic losses from poor litter and litter management. So foot and leg problems, breast blisters, respiratory infections, poor weight gain, that sort of thing as well. So just moving on to the next project, which is the current one, where we're looking at a risk assessment process for alternative litters. So to even be able to do that, we needed to come up with get the hazards and risks that might be associated with using litter in sheds. So we're putting together a journal paper with that, which I'll discuss a bit more in a minute. And then develop a risk assessment method, which we're developing up a tool to do that with. And then we want to actually test that tool and those hazards, so our thresholds we're developing up with some potential alternative litters. So just quickly on the risk assessment process, there's a whole bunch of ways of going about it. Some of you guys might be familiar with it for HACCP and things like that. So yeah, there's an Australian standard for it, which uses the likelihood and consequence method for doing a risk assessment to evaluate the risk. And yeah, there are obviously other processes to go about doing risk assessment. So obviously, yeah, when you're looking at likelihood, just looking at that figure there, likelihood and risk, if they're both, the likelihood of it, the consequence of it, if they're both low, you know you're pretty safe. If you've got the likelihood of something happening and the consequences are going to be pretty bad, then you're up in the red area and you probably don't want to touch the stuff. So likelihood, just summarising, is the extent to which something is likely, the probability of something occurring, consequence as a result of the effect, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant, one that's unwanted. So we've obviously looked at a whole bunch of different risk assessments because they're used quite commonly in a lot of areas. So there's environmental ones, biosecurity ones you'd be familiar with, human health risk assessments, which is obviously a pretty big deal in the world at the moment, animal health risk assessments, and also workplace health and safety risk assessment stuff as well that you would commonly have to deal with. They all have a common approach around hazard identification, so looking at the dose response assessment, which I'll cover in a minute, the exposure of it, and the risk estimation and characterisation. So HACCP was not chosen because we're also looking at, it's pretty useful, that one, for food safety, but we've also got to deal with bird health and environment, so not just food safety here as part of the risk assessment with the litter. So we're trying to cover 3 areas. So I've developed up a bit of a draft risk assessment there, which we're developing into an Excel tool. So the first part of it is a bit of a suitability screening process that we're using, which comes from that earlier project I just talked about. So there's stuff that come out of that project with litters that are basically unsuitable or suitable or not suitable. So that's that first step, to use that. Then we go through obviously the hazard identification. If there's no hazards, low risk, you can probably use the stuff commercially. Otherwise, you go down to potentially apply mitigation options, or you don't. You just go to testing for threshold values and assessing against those, coming up with a risk score out of there. So it's that quantitative scoring there. If you get a low score, it's probably safe to use. If you don't, you've got to go back, apply some mitigation, or go back and select an alternative litter there. If you get a medium risk, maybe there's the option to go and do some small-scale trials and monitor bird health, which is a bit more obvious when I cover the next couple of slides. The suitability screening, as I said, was based on the previous project we just talked about just earlier. So there was obviously suitable might need pre-treatment, such as drying, crushing it, further research required, or it might be unknown, or it falls into the unsuitable category. So to develop up this journal paper, we worked with a lady at the University of New England, Priscilla Gerber, who basically did a very thorough lit review through all the literature you could find relating to this subject, and looking at the critical thresholds of each pathogen and contaminant hazard identified in the literature. So where possible, these were established with respect to the dose-response relationship. So the harm to the birds, as I said, so the three things we had to cover: harm to the birds, environmental harm, and food safety is obviously a very big one. And needed one critical threshold. You might have a different threshold, a different concentration for all of those. So basically you find a whole bunch of those, look at things like FSANZ, Australian APVMA data and stuff. And also there's a fairly extensive lit review done on feedstuffs back about 7 or 8 years ago that's been published. So guidance levels for contaminants and feed that would not result in exceedances were looked at in the edible tissue of the chicken or the health of the chicken. So our risk assessment is a bit conservative in that we sort of have to make the assumption when there's no data really around on the values that are safe in litter, we have to sort of start with what's actually in the feed to begin with. But knowing that birds only eat a fairly small amount of feed from the literature, about 6%, and it's even guesstimated might be less than that, particularly with some sorts of litter that aren't as palatable to them. Looked at this issue of the no observed effect as part of those thresholds and the lowest observed effect. We also needed to take into account that it might not just be ingestion. So obviously they spend a lot of time lying and in contact with the litter and in the shed. So inhalation and skin contact might be another uptake pathway for contaminants. So the different contaminants, we split them into categories there: organic chemical ones, elemental contaminants, so your heavy metals, the biological ones, the phytotoxins, the mycotoxins, microorganisms, and physical ones, like you might get splinters or nails or that sort of thing. So why we needed that journal paper is to go back to the risk assessment, is something to feed these thresholds into to evaluate against, to give us a risk score. So that's how it fits into our risk assessment process. So that's about it. Thanks to AgriFutures for funding both of those projects, and I've got my name and contact details up there to contact me if you like.